The swinging doors of the saloon caught the last light of evening and threw twin shadows across the dust when Silas Boone pushed through them, his boots loud on the boards, his jaw set like a man who had already lost an argument he had not yet started. Behind the bar stood Su-Yin Lai, 26 years old, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a rag in one hand, and a look on her face that said she had heard every kind of man walk through that door, and this one was nothing new. The saloon had been her husband's before the fever took him 2 winters back, and it was hers now, deed and debt both, in a town called Widow Creek that had not decided yet whether it wanted her to keep it. Silas set his hat on the bar top and said the words plainly, the way a man says something he has rehearsed on the ride into town. He needed a wife by tomorrow. Su-Yin did not laugh, though something in her chest wanted to. She set the rag down instead and asked him why a man would say a thing like that to a stranger pouring his whiskey. And Silas told her about the letter from the Territorial Land Office, about the widow's clause his late uncle had built into a homestead claim that would revert to the railroad company if it was not held by a married couple come the first of the month. He had 320 acres of good bottomland riding on a wedding band, and less than a day to find someone willing to wear one. Su-Yin studied him across the bar the way she studied a man deciding whether to start trouble, weighing his hands, his eyes, the way his shoulders sat. He had dust in the creases of his knuckles, and a burn across the back of his left hand that looked older than the coat he wore, and neither detail told her whether he was honest or merely desperate, which, in her experience, were not always different things. Then she told him that if he was serious, he would need to promise her some things first, and the saloon went quiet enough that the piano player in the corner stopped mid-note to listen. Widow Creek sat in the high, dry country of Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1877, a town built around a stage stop and a spring that never quite ran dry, even in August. It had one street of clapboard buildings leaning into each other like tired men, a livery, a mercantile, a church with a bell nobody had gotten around to hanging, and Su-Yin's saloon, called the Lucky Star, which her husband Zhu Lai had built with his own hands after coming west on the railroad cruise and staying when the rails moved on without him. He had married her by proxy, a woman he had never met until she stepped off a wagon from the coast with a single trunk and a portrait of her mother. And in 3 years together he had taught her the business, and she had taught him patience. And then the fever came through in the winter of '75 and took him in 11 days. Su-Yin had buried him on the rise behind the church, the only Chinese grave in a cemetery of white crosses, and she had kept the saloon open every night since, because closing it would have meant admitting she had nothing left to hold on to. The town tolerated her. Tolerance in Widow Creek was not the same as welcome. She poured drinks for ranch hands who would not meet her eyes, and merchants who counted their change twice when she handed it back, and she had learned to carry herself like a woman who did not need anyone's good opinion, because she had found out the hard way that needing it changed nothing. She had learned other things, too, in 2 years alone behind that bar. She had learned which men drank to forget, and which drank to build courage for meanness, and she poured accordingly. She had learned to keep a short club under the bar where her hand could find it without looking, though she had only needed it twice. She had learned the particular loneliness of a woman who ran a business in a town that spoke to her only when it wanted something, and she had built her days around that loneliness the way a person builds a fence around a well, not to hide the water, only to keep from falling in. Silas Boone had ridden into town 3 days before with dust on his coat and a folded letter in his breast pocket that he had read so many times the creases had gone soft. His Uncle Ezra had staked the claim outside town back in '68, one of the first homestead filings in the county. 320 acres of grass and creek water that Silas had worked alone since Ezra passed the autumn before. The clause in the original filing had been common enough in those early years, a way the land office encouraged settlement by families instead of solitary men who might abandon a claim come the first hard winter. Married, working the land together, the claim stood. Unmarried past the 5-year mark from the original filing, and the land reverted, available for purchase by the railroad company that had been buying up bottom land along the creek for 2 years running, offering settlers half what the land was worth and taking it anyway when they could not refuse. Silas had ignored the clause for years, certain Ezra would find a way around it. And now Ezra was dead, and the deadline was the 1st of the month, and the month began tomorrow. He had ridden to Widow Creek because it was the only town within 2 days' ride with a preacher, and he had walked into the Lucky Star because it was the only place open past dark, and he had not expected the woman behind the bar to be the one who changed the shape of his plan entirely. He had spent 2 nights before that walking the fence lines of Ezra's claim in the dark, unable to sleep, running through every name of every unmarried woman he had ever met, and coming up empty each time. Because the honest truth was he had spent so many years working the land alone that he barely knew how to speak to a woman past ordering a meal. But Su Yin's answer was not a plan he had rehearsed for. She told him this was not a matter of standing before a preacher and signing a paper, that a marriage on land office documents still meant a woman's name tied to a man's decisions for as long as the paper held, and if he wanted her name on it, he would need to agree to terms first. Silas asked what terms, and Su Yin counted them on her fingers the way she counted a bar tab. The saloon stayed hers, deed in her name alone, no matter what happened between them after the wedding. Any children were not part of this arrangement, she said plainly, because this was a contract of land and survival, not a household, and she wanted that understood before either of them said a word to a preacher. If the marriage was only paper, it stayed only paper. No expectation past what the law required to be witnessed. And if he ever raised a hand to her, or spoke to her the way half the men in this town spoke to her when they thought she could not hear, the arrangement ended the moment it happened, claim or no claim. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting, which surprised her more than anything he might have said. And when she finished, he took off his hat and held it against his chest like a man in church, and told her he could promise every one of those things honestly, because he had not come to Widow Creek looking for a wife. He had come looking for someone willing to save a piece of land that was the only thing his uncle had left him. And if that someone happened to be her, he would keep his word, or she could tear the paper up herself. Su Yin poured him a second whiskey he had not asked for, on the house, which was the closest thing to agreement she was willing to give that night, and told him to come back at first light if he still meant what he said once the whiskey wore off. He was there before the sun cleared the ridge, standing outside the saloon door with his hat already in his hands. The wedding took place the next morning in the small church with the bell that had never been hung, Reverend Amos Whitfield presiding over a ceremony that took 11 minutes and drew a crowd of exactly 4 people, none of whom smiled. Su Yin wore a plain gray dress instead of anything resembling a bride's, and Silas wore the same coat he had ridden in on, and when the Reverend pronounced them married, neither of them touched the other beyond a handshake that Silas offered because he did not know what else was appropriate under the circumstances. Reverend Whitfield signed the certificate with a heavy hand and told them both, not unkindly, that he had married stranger couples than this one over the years, and most of them had turned out fine, which was meant as comfort and landed somewhere closer to a warning. But the town noticed. By noon, the mercantile owner's wife had told 3 other women that the Chinese widow from the saloon had married a stranger for his land. And by evening the story had grown enough teeth that when Su Yin walked to the general store for supplies, the owner, a heavy-set man named Walter Pruitt, who ran the only mercantile in town and sat on the small council that decided such things as business licenses and grazing permits, stepped out from behind his counter and blocked her path before she reached the flour barrel. He told her plainly that Widow Creek did not take kindly to marriages of convenience dressed up as legitimate, that a woman using a man's name to hold on to property she had no honest claim to was the kind of thing that got looked into by the territorial marshal, and that perhaps it was time the council reconsidered whether her saloon's license ought to be renewed come the fall. Su Yin felt something go still and cold behind her ribs, the particular quiet that came before she said something she could not take back. But before she could answer, the mercantile door opened again, and Silas walked in, having tracked her from the livery where he had gone to check on his horse. He did not raise his voice. That was the thing Su Yin noticed first, the thing that surprised her even though she had watched him keep his composure at the bar 2 nights before. He simply asked Pruitt whether a business license in this territory was contingent on a woman's marital arrangements or on whether she paid her taxes and kept an orderly establishment. And when Pruitt started to answer with something about propriety, Silas asked him a second question, whether Pruitt had ever once, in the 2 years since Joe Lai passed, extended Su Yin the same courtesy of credit he extended every rancher in the valley, or whether he had made her pay cash on the barrelhead every single time while carrying half the county on a ledger. Pruitt's face went the color of old brick. The store had gone quiet enough to hear the flies against the window glass. Su Yin watched Silas stand there, unarmed, unhurried, a man who had walked into a fight that was not his and made it his without raising a fist. And she understood in that moment that whatever else this arrangement was, it was not going to be the empty paper transaction she had assumed it would be. Pruitt backed down, muttering something about checking his records, and Silas paid for Su Yin's flour and sugar himself before she could stop him, and the two of them walked out into the street together while half the town watched from windows and porches, and nobody said a single word out loud, though everybody had plenty to say once the door closed behind them. Su Yin waited until they were clear of the mercantile steps before she told him he had not needed to do that she had been fighting Pruitt's small cruelties alone for 2 years, and would have found her own way through this one too. Silas only shrugged and said that a man did not need a reason beyond what was right in front of him, and that she could argue with him about it later if it still bothered her once her hands stopped shaking, because he had noticed they were shaking now, even if her voice had not given anything away. That night the Lucky Star stayed open as usual, and Silas sat at the end of the bar nursing one whiskey slower than any man Su Yin had ever served, watching her work the room with an ease that most of the customers took for granted, and he did not. She handled a drunk cattle buyer who got too familiar with his hands by pouring his next drink an inch shy, and telling him plainly that the next time he touched her arm he would find himself outside in the horse trough, and the man laughed it off but did not touch her again. She broke up an argument between 2 ranch hands over a card game with nothing but a level voice and the threat of banning them both, and they backed down because they knew she meant it. Silas watched all of this and understood something he had not expected to understand, that the woman he had married for a piece of paper ran her establishment with more authority than most men he had known run a herd, and that the town's coldness toward her had less to do with what she had done wrong and everything to do with what she had refused to be, which was small and quiet and grateful for scraps. When the bar finally cleared past midnight, Su Yin locked the door and found Silas still sitting there, and she asked him why he had stepped in at the mercantile when their arrangement did not require it of him. He turned his glass in slow circles and told her that a man who watched another person get run over and said nothing was not a man he wanted to be, contract or no contract, and that whatever else came of this marriage, he intended to keep the parts of his word that were not written down, along with the parts that were. She asked him then, quietly, whether he had a place to sleep that night, since the arrangement had never covered such a plain necessity, and Silas admitted he had been bedding down in the livery stall next to his horse since he arrived, which was not an admission he had planned to make. Su-yin told him there was a cot in the storeroom behind the bar, clean enough, and that a husband sleeping in a horse stall would draw more talk than the marriage already had, and Silas took the offer without argument, grateful in a way he did not know how to say out loud. But the trouble did not end at the mercantile. It only changed shape. 3 days later, a rider came through from the railroad company's land office in the county seat, a clerk named Rufus Dalling, who carried a leather satchel of documents and a manner so polite it made the hair rise on the back of Su-yin's neck the moment he walked into the saloon looking for Silas. Dalling explained, with a smile that never reached his eyes, that the railroad company had reviewed the marriage filing and had some questions about its validity, given the unusual circumstances of a marriage performed the day before a legal deadline, and given certain irregularities in the original 1868 claim that his employers believed warranted a closer look, regardless of the marriage's legitimacy. He was polite the entire time he said it, which was exactly what made it dangerous, and Su-yin understood before Silas did that this was not a bureaucratic formality. This was a company that had wanted that bottomland for 2 years and had finally found a wedge to pry it loose, and a hastily arranged marriage between a homesteader and a Chinese widow gave them precisely the kind of story that would look sympathetic in a courtroom in the county seat, where juries were composed of men who might not think twice about ruling against her. Silas told Dalling he would provide whatever documentation the land office required, and Dalling left with the same smile, and after the door closed, Silas sat down heavy in a chair and put his head in his hands. And for the first time since Su-yin had met him, he looked like a man who did not know what to do next. That evening, after the saloon closed, Su-yin brought a bottle up to the small room above the bar where she had lived alone since Joe died, and she found Silas sitting on the back step of the building, looking out at the dark shape of the hills where his claim sat, waiting. She sat down beside him without asking, and for a long while neither of them said anything. And then Silas began to talk, quietly, about his Uncle Ezra, about how the old man had come out to this territory with nothing but a mule and a dream of land that was truly his own, land nobody could take from him the way things had been taken from their family back east. He told her that the claim was not just dirt and grass to him. It was the only proof he had that his uncle's life had meant something, that a man could come out here with nothing and leave something behind worth fighting for. Su-yin listened, and when he finished, she told him something she had never said aloud to anyone in Widow Creek, that she understood exactly what he meant. Because the saloon was the same thing to her. Joe had built it plank by plank with his own hands, had taught himself the business from nothing, had made a place for himself in a town that had not wanted him there any more than it wanted her. Keeping it open was not about money. It was about refusing to let the town erase the fact that he had existed, that he had mattered, that a man with no family and no fortune could still build something lasting with nothing but stubbornness and 2 good hands. She told him, too, about the portrait of her mother she still kept in the trunk upstairs, and how some nights she took it out and talked to it the way a foolish woman talks to a picture, telling it about the day's small victories and defeats, because there was no one else left in this territory who shared her blood or her language. And Silas listened to that without saying a word, only nodding, the way a man nods when he understands a loneliness he has felt himself, but never had the words for. Silas turned to look at her then, and something in his face had changed, softened in a way she had not seen from him before, and he told her that he had not expected when he walked into her saloon 3 nights ago asking for a wife, that he would end up understanding a person the way he understood her now. Su Yin did not answer that directly, but she did not move away from him either, and when his hand found hers on the step between them, she let it stay there. They sat like that until the last lamp in the mercantile across the street went dark, and the whole town settled into the particular silence of a frontier night. Crickets and wind, and the far-off sound of a coyote testing the hills. And neither of them spoke of the railroad company, or the marriage certificate, or anything at all beyond the simple fact of 2 hands resting together on a wooden step. The second and larger danger arrived 4 days after that, on a hot afternoon when the whole town had gathered at the mercantile for the arrival of the mail wagon, and Rufus Dawling returned, this time not alone but with 2 hired men from the railroad company, and a folded writ that he presented to Silas in front of half the town. The writ claimed that the original 1868 homestead filing contained a surveying error that placed the western boundary of the claim on land the railroad had already purchased from a different party, and that pending resolution of the boundary dispute, the company was formally contesting Silas's right to the land, regardless of his marital status. It was a manufactured claim, Su Yin realized immediately, watching Dawling's men shift their weight the way men do when they are prepared for trouble rather than paperwork. A legal maneuver built to drag the matter into court long enough that the company could occupy and improve the disputed ground before any judge ever ruled on it. A common enough tactic in territories where the law moved slower than money did. Silas read the writ with his jaw tight, and when he looked up his eyes found Su Yin's across the crowd, and she understood that whatever came next, it would not wait for a courtroom. Dawling's men began walking toward the livery where Silas kept his horse, clearly intending to ride out to the claim that very afternoon and begin whatever occupation the company had planned. And the crowd of townsfolk watched with the particular stillness of people who wanted to see what would happen, but did not want to be the ones who made it happen. Su Yin did not wait for Silas to decide what to do. She stepped forward, past Pruitt's mercantile counter, past the postmaster, past every person in Widow Creek who had spent 2 years deciding she did not belong, and she told Dawling in a voice that carried across the whole street that she had witnessed the original survey markers on that claim with her own eyes, riding out with her late husband 3 years before to deliver goods to old Ezra Boone, and that the western boundary Dawling was disputing sat a full quarter-mile east of any land the railroad had ever purchased, a fact she was prepared to swear to before any judge in the territory. Dawling's smile faltered for the first time since Su Yin had met him. He told her, with less politeness now, that the testimony of a saloon owner would carry little weight against a company survey, and Su Yin answered that a company survey conducted by men paid to find whatever boundary the company wanted to find would carry little weight either, once a judge learned that the surveyor in question, a man named Otis Redmond, had been dismissed from 2 prior county positions for falsifying claim documents, a fact she happened to know because Redmond had been a regular customer of the Lucky Star before his dismissals became public knowledge. And men talked more than they realized when they had been drinking. The crowd around them had gone very quiet. Dawling looked at his 2 hired men, looked at the growing number of townsfolk who were now listening with real interest rather than idle curiosity, and understood that whatever advantage he had walked in with was evaporating in front of witnesses who would remember every word of it. He folded the writ back into his satchel, told Silas the company would be in touch through proper legal channels, and rode out of town with his men before the mail wagon had even finished unloading. The confrontation left the street buzzing, but it left something else too. A shift Su Yin could feel even as she stood there with her heart still pounding, because for the first time since she had come to Widow Creek, She had stood in the open street and spoken with authority, and the town had listened instead of looking away. Pruitt approached her afterward, awkward in a way she had never seen from him, and told her that he had not known about Redmond's history, and that perhaps he had been too quick to judge the circumstances of her marriage without understanding the woman making it. It was not an apology, not quite, but it was more than she had gotten from him in 2 years, and Su Yin accepted it for what it was. An old rancher named Otto Kessler, who had drunk at her bar for 2 years without ever once offering her his given name, tipped his hat to her in the street that afternoon and called her Mrs. Boone, and Su Yin found that the sound of it, spoken by a man who had barely acknowledged her before, settled something in her chest she had not known was unsettled. Silas found her a few minutes later standing near the livery with her hands still shaking slightly from the confrontation, and he did not say anything about the claim or the railroad or what came next. He simply took her hand again, the way he had on the back step, and told her that whatever the law eventually decided about his uncle's boundary lines, he already knew the most important thing that had come out of this whole arrangement, which was that he had married a woman braver than any man he had ridden with, and he did not intend to let a piece of paper be the only thing binding them together going forward, if she would have him beyond what the contract required. Su Yin did not answer him immediately. She had spent 2 years building walls around herself in this town, walls that had kept her upright when grief and coldness both might have broken her, and she was not a woman who tore walls down quickly. But she thought of the 11 minutes in the church, of the handshake instead of a kiss, of the terms she had laid out across the bar the first night they met, terms built to protect herself from exactly this kind of hope. She thought of Joe, and how he had built something out of nothing in a place that did not want him, and how she had honored his memory by refusing to let anyone diminish what remained. And she thought that perhaps honoring what he had built did not mean refusing every good thing that came after it. That evening she walked up to the rise behind the church alone, before answering Silas at all, and stood at Joe's grave for a long while, telling him plainly, the way she always did, about the day's events, and admitting to the wooden cross that she did not know what to do with a man who kept his word without being asked to. She came down from the rise with her mind settled in a way it had not been in 2 years. She told Silas the contract still stood, the saloon still hers, no expectations she had not agreed to. But she told him also that if he meant what he said, she was willing to see what grew between them honestly, without the deadline of a land office clause forcing either of their hands. Silas smiled then, the first full smile she had seen from him since he walked through her saloon doors asking for a wife by tomorrow, and he told her that was all he had wanted to hear. There was a quiet evening in early August, before the railroad matter was fully settled, when a summer storm rolled through Widow Creek fast and mean, the kind that came off the western ridges without warning and dropped hail the size of knuckles across the whole valley in under an hour. Silas had been out at the claim when it hit, and Su Yin closed the saloon early and stood on the porch watching the black clouds pile up over the hills, unable to do anything but wait. And she found herself surprised by how much the waiting hurt, how her hands gripped the porch rail the way they had not gripped anything since Joe's final fevered night. When Silas rode in an hour after dark, soaked through and favoring one shoulder where a fence post had caught him wrong helping a neighbor secure loose stock, Su Yin did not scold him for the risk he had taken. She simply pulled him inside, set water to boil, and sat with him at the small table while she cleaned the scrape on his shoulder, her hands steady even though her chest was not. Silas watched her work in the lamplight and told her, half joking, that she had a healer's hands to go with her bartender's nerve, and Su Yin told him plainly that she had learned to keep her hands steady a long time ago, because a woman alone in this territory did not have the luxury of shaking, not where anyone could see it. He asked her, quietly, if she ever allowed herself to shake at all, and she admitted, after a long pause, that she had, once, the night Joe died, and never since. Silas did not press her further. He only reached over and covered her hand with his own for a moment before she went back to bandaging his shoulder, and something passed between them that neither one named aloud, though both of them understood it had shifted the ground they stood on. 3 months passed before the railroad company formally withdrew its claim, once the county surveyor, prompted by Su Yin's public testimony and Redmond's documented history, conducted an independent review that confirmed the original 1868 boundary exactly where she had said it stood. Silas kept his 320 acres free and clear, the deed recorded permanently in both their names as a legally married couple, no claws left hanging over either of their heads. The lucky star stayed in Su Yin's name alone, exactly as she had demanded that first night, though by autumn Silas had built a second room onto the back of the building, a small kitchen where the two of them ate breakfast together most mornings, before he rode out to his claim and she opened the bar for the evening trade. Walter Pruitt extended her credit at the Mercantile for the first time in 2 years, and when a group of new settlers passed through Widow Creek that fall, asking about reliable places to trade, more than one longtime resident pointed them toward the widow at the Lucky Star, telling them she ran the most honest establishment in the county and had the courage to prove it in open daylight when it mattered most. Silas brought in his first full harvest off the bottomland that October, better than any yield his uncle had managed in his final years working the claim alone, and he set aside a portion of the proceeds without telling Su Yin, using it to replace the saloon's cracked front windows and repaint the sign above the door, a small, unspoken gift that she noticed the moment she came downstairs one morning and said nothing about, only touched the fresh paint with 2 fingers before opening for the day. The grave on the rise behind the church still bore Joe Lai's name, and Su Yin still visited it every Sunday, but she no longer visited it alone. Silas walked up with her most weeks now, not because the contract required it, but because somewhere in the space between a rushed wedding and a fought boundary line, he had come to understand that honoring the dead sometimes meant standing quietly beside the living who still carried them. On a clear evening in late September, Silas found Su Yin behind the bar, polishing glasses in the same spot where he had first told her he needed a wife by tomorrow, and he set his hat down on the bar top the same way he had that first night, and he told her that he had ridden into Widow Creek 3 months before, looking to save a piece of land, and instead he had found something he had not known he was missing, a partner who met every hard thing life put in front of her, without flinching, and without asking anyone's permission to do so. Su Yin set down the glass she was polishing and looked at him across the same bar where she had once laid out terms to a stranger, and she told him that the land had never really been the thing worth saving. It had only ever been the reason 2 stubborn, guarded people finally let each other close enough to find out what they were actually made of. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.